Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Today, Sonia is interviewing John about the apparent contradiction in the Bible regarding the year of Jesus' birth. Matthew tells us Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, who, we are told, died in 4 BC, while Luke tells us Jesus was born during a census conducted when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and we are told that this man did not govern until AD 6. Can these assertions be reconciled? It will take several episodes to cover this topic, so if any episode ends with the contradiction still being unresolved, never fear. Tune in to the subsequent episode to find out this challenge addressed in full. If you miss any episodes, you can find them in our podcast. See truthinmydays.com for the location. We hope you enjoy the series.
The argument is that we know Quirinius was ruler in 6 AD, but this is too late to represent Jesus' birth and be the explanation for why Mary and Joseph have come south from Nazareth down into Judea and to Bethlehem. This is certainly correct. We do have a historical anomaly here at this point.
Is there any chance that Quirinius could have been governor twice?
Some do make that suggestion, and we will look at that when we look at the different possible solutions. Suffice it to say here that Dr. Bach says this is a good historical problem and even raises the possibility, another response is that it is possible Luke had this kind of detail incorrect. It is conceivable. Daniel Wallace, he writes this text, he's speaking of Luke 2:2, this text casts serious doubts on Luke's accuracy for two reasons. One, the earliest known Roman census in Palestine was taken in 6 to 7 CE. And two, there's little, if any, evidence that Quirinius was governor of Syria before Herod's death in 4 BCE. In light of this, many scholars believe that Luke was thinking about the census in 6 to 7 CE when Quirinius was governor of Syria.
On the other hand, it doesn't quite sound like he's totally cutting off the possibility. I mean, earliest known Roman census, like there could have been one that's just not mentioned by other sources, and little, if any, evidence, but just because we don't have it somewhere else that he was governor before Herod's death in 4 BC doesn't mean it's impossible, does it?
Well, it may not, but the reason Wallace says this casts serious doubts on Luke's accuracy is, to skeptics and to many people, it just seemed like special pleading to say, well, we have no evidence that he governed before, but he probably did, or maybe he did. If you make a positive assertion, there's a burden of proof on you. And furthermore, Tobin, whom we mentioned earlier, gives us a list of governors of Syria, recorded governors of Syria, and claims on the basis of that list that there's no place to pigeonhole Quirinius in at the required time. So this is why Wallace will tell us that this casts serious doubts on Luke's accuracy, and it should be noted how evangelical scholars are ready to question the accuracy of the gospel books. Well, let's sum up the charges to this point and take a look at them in detail, because this is just part of it. There's more. Charges. It is impossible to reconcile Matthew's claim that Jesus was born before the death of Herod with Luke's claim that Jesus was born while Quirinius was governing Syria, since Herod died in 4 BC and Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until AD 6. And as we mentioned, this is perhaps the single most common attack on the historical reliability of the gospel books that are levied by skeptics. But there's more. They also claim that there's no historical record of a census of the entire Roman world. Well, we see Luke says that Caesar Augustus decreed that the entire Roman world should be registered, and they say there's no historical evidence of any census of the entire Roman world. Censuses, we're told, were done piecemeal and involved only Roman citizens. We're also told that no Roman census would have been made in Judea during the reign of Herod, because Herod was a client king, so he had a certain degree of autonomy in Judea. We're told that Roman censuses did not require people to return to their ancestral homes, but to where they owned property. These are the various charges brought against the birth narratives of Jesus. So let's now look at the way evangelicals seek to respond to these, see if there's any validity to these attempts, see what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then see if we can come up with something else that might be better. So, the first attempt at defense is to say that the census may have been conducted by an earlier governor, perhaps Saturninus.
How's that a defense?
Well, it isn't much of one, really, because Luke does specify that it was done while Quirinius was governing Syria. So this supposed defense would be admitting that Luke made a serious blunder here, which would, in fact, undercut the trustworthiness of the accounts, which is exactly what liberal scholars are doing, or trying to do here. Another attempt is to say that, this is from Bach, my own solution is that Augustus got organized to take this census, and the mechanizations of it took place somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC, but the census was not actually executed until Quirinius. In other words, the census was taken under Augustus, then Quirinius took the data, put it together, and presented it to Rome. So Rome actually began to make use of it for taxation under Quirinius. Do you see a problem with that attempted defense?
Well, while Quirinius was governing, it doesn't sound like he came into the picture later. It sounds like it's contemporaneous.
Yes, it doesn't say in the text that the census was finished when Quirinius was governing, but that it was first done when Quirinius was governing. So it's the similar sort of problem as to the first defense. If we're told that, well, Quirinius is just putting the data together and actually the census was done before him, well, then we're back to the same problem. It must have been done under a different governor. And it would be the same error that we have in the first place. And you also wonder if Luke is describing the birth narrative of Jesus, why is he appealing to something that might have happened 10 years later to situate it in time and place? That's not Luke's usual style. If you look at passages like Luke 3:1, he ties his narrative into the historical events at the time. If you look at Luke 3:1, he talks about who was governing where and who was holding what position when at the time that John the Baptist begins his ministry. Not, well, who was doing something 10 years later. That wouldn't seem to make sense. Another attempt at defense, then, is to say that perhaps the decree and the census were two distinct events. The decree first and the census 10 years later. Does that sound viable?
Not really. I guess I'd have to go back and read the passage to see if there's a way to twist it. Fit it in like that.
Good choice of words there, yeah. The text clearly has Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem for the census when Jesus was born. The census was therefore not 10 years later. It absolutely makes no sense that the Roman emperor would decree that a census be done and people drag their heels for 10 years before they get around to obeying the emperor. That seems to be a rather desperate expedient. Now, a variation of that is to say that perhaps there were two distinct events, the census, and then 10 years later, the levying of taxes based on the census. So the decree goes out earlier and the census is done earlier, but then it's used to levy taxes 10 years later during Quirinius' time. Does that one sound reasonable?
No.
I wouldn't think so. The text actually says nothing about taxes. It says the census during which Jesus was born was done when Quirinius was governing Syria, not that some later taxation was done when Quirinius was governing Syria.
Would they have had to travel there to be taxed?
That's another claim from the skeptics, the liberal scholars, that no, they wouldn't have had to. But we'll get to that challenge as well. And I think the reason this might come up and why some make a mistake is if you read in the old King James Version, this is what you read. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. So you see, all the world should be taxed. This taxing was first made, all went to be taxed. It doesn't say tax. You won't see that in, say, the New King James Version, because the word is not the word for tax. The word is the word for registered and census, not for taxing.
So that's just a mistake in King James Version, or is it based on a different text?
It's a mistranslation, the King James Version. King James Version and New King James Version, New Testaments use the same text. Now here's another one. Perhaps Quirinius conducted 2 censuses. The first during the time of Jesus' birth, and the second in AD 6. Sound reasonable?
Well, it seems weird that they'd have the censuses so close together.
That may seem a little strange, yes. And again, some would say this is special pleading because there's no evidence of this putative earlier census. And we're told he could not have done one in Judea while Herod was king anyway. So how did he do this earlier one? Now here's another one that you might find more interesting. And this defense says Luke 2:2 should be translated, this census took place before Quirinius was governing Syria, instead of this census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. If it could be translated that way, would that solve the problem?
I guess it could.
It could. It would raise the question why, again, tie it into history before to something that happens after the fact. Maybe because the census done by Quirinius was much better known, so Luke is trying to specify this as one that was done before that one you're thinking of. However, let's hear what Daniel Wallace has to say in response. Can you read this to us and then give us your expert opinion?
Okay, so he says, prote is sometimes regarded as adverbial. This census took place before Quirinius was governor of Syria. The advantage of this approach is that it eludes the historical problem of Quirinius' governorship overlapping the reign of Herod. However, it erroneously presupposes that haute modifies apographe. But since the construction is anarthrous, such a view is almost impossible, because when a demonstrative functions attributively to a noun, the noun is almost always articular.
You think you can explain that to our readers?
Okay, so when you have a word like this or that describing a noun, like this census, Greek has to use the word the, like say something like this the census, but where we wouldn't say it like that in English, but for their construction they have to have it there. But in this case, there is no word the in the Greek, so it's not allowable to translate it like that.
And that's Wallace's responses, and this is why Wallace is concerned about this issue. No article there, you can't translate it this way. What if the article is there, though? Could you do it then?
Well, let's see, what would the text look like then?
It would look like this.
The word order looks a little bit weird, but...
Well, the order is exactly the same. The only difference is the insertion of that article. Now, Wallace told us you can't translate it as before because the article is not there. Okay, that's the only objection. If the article is there, you could translate that way. And look at that. How many of the manuscripts actually have the article in it there?
Oh, 99.4%.
Exactly. How many of them are missing the article?
0.6%.
Yeah, so here's the problem. This is an issue of textual criticism. We haven't really talked about this yet. We will. The reality is the article is there in the Greek text. So this is a viable solution. There's a very, very few manuscripts, 0.6%, 6 out of every 1,000 manuscripts that have accidentally dropped out the article. Unfortunately, Wallace believes that that's the correct original text. He believes, therefore, that the article was not there, and so it cannot be translated that way.
Well, okay, Wallace believes that, but what about all those other authors in those other books that you cited?
Every scholar who accepts the critical text as closest to the original will side with Wallace on this and will rule out this solution. And they all do.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube.